just come on up. We won't get started just yet. I think we need to get this trending so that people join. It's typically a slow start. I feel like we're doing a show and there's no room in terms of time. And so, hey, Liam, I'm going to switch boxes with you. So here's what I'm going to do. How are you?
Good. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me clearly?
I can, yeah.
All right. So if you want to get your camera on, are you okay with camera today?
Yeah, that's fine. I was just messing around with the camera stand. Let's see how it.
Cool. Whenever you're ready, and then I'll switch my position, get you on the big screen. Once your camera's on, and then we'll wait, about 5-10 minutes if you're okay with that, and we'll go from there. Is that cool?
Sure, yeah.
All right, let's see if I can switch you here. Make sure I can switch. All right, cool. You're on the big screen now. How are you, sir?
Good.
How was your day?
Tiring.
You had a week off last week, right?
Well, if you want to consider it a week off, I still did a ton of other stuff, and I'm still working in. I'm building a fence in my yard, and I'm really running out of time too because of the winter.
Yeah, I'm not good at that stuff. I am terrible when it comes to building things. Now, what I do well is change outlets. So I'm effective at doing that.
Yeah, I'm slow in part because I don't do these things often enough, and in part because I work 60-hour weeks already. But I've been slowly restoring my grandfather's old cabin.
Nice.
So I've redone the flooring, a bunch of the plumbing work already. I did a bunch of work on the deck. I'm building a fence. I have a ton of stuff to do still.
Good for you. And Muffin Man says, "What's up, Professor?"
Get a scoot, dude. Howdy. Good to see you.
So let's see. So again, share the live, folks. We'll get started in about 9 minutes. I've got. What would you like me to call you?
I should share this thing too, right? How does that work?
Yeah.
I've never shared.
You see that arrow out button?
Okay.
That arrow that points to the right. Just click on that.
Yeah.
And then share with your friends. Yeah. Just you could do 15 at a time.
Oh, you got to pick the individual people.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's no mass share. Not that I know of, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Even it's on my phone and on the stand, that'd be really hard to do.
Yeah, I learned how to mirror my phone to my computer today. I'm getting better at technology.
You can do.
Yeah, so things.
Can you do at a time?
Huh?
15. You said how many? I might grab a bunch of.
Yeah, Miriam. Today, I'm interviewing Professor Liam O'Mara. We're talking about his work in the Middle East, his work in Europe. And so join us. So it's going to be a great history lesson. I've joined Liam on a couple of occasions. I think a couple of weeks ago is when I met him. So I'll share that a little bit. Spent an hour and a half with him, just listening, quite frankly, and learned so much. It forced me to go do some more homework, candidly speaking. So stick around. We're gonna do it in an interview format, one-on-one with Liam. We will field questions from the chat as well. We'll do our best. I don't see Moody in the chat, but I don't know if Greek Lafrique is still on. If you're on, maybe you can. Would you mind modding for us? That would be great. If Moody doesn't join us here shortly, anyone who's willing to mod. And the reason I'm asking for that is just so that we can field questions from the chat. Mute anybody that spews hate rhetoric. We won't tolerate that. This is about being informed, educated, and asking questions. The beautiful thing about life is that we don't know everything, right? And other people might have different experiences than we do. So we want to be able to leverage that and pay back in our own way. Falha, yeah, if you want to come up and if you want to just I'll make you a mod, and then you can come up, and then I'll put you in the box at the bottom, put you in one of the boxes. So just request if you have 200 followers, and then I'll kind of walk us through housekeeping here in a little bit. Um, Lisa's your mod too, or Lisa? Are both Lisa and Fal your mods?
Me?
Yeah,
Uh,
Lisa.
uh, Faisal's been up a number of times with me.
Okay,
I don't
cool.
remember if he's a mod or not. I think he might be. Yeah, I think he was. I think we did that recently. Yeah.
Oh, let's do. I think Kim sent came comes
Lisa
up
is.
first.
Celine is. I'm seeing other people popping up.
Yeah, yeah. Let me see. Let me see. Let me see Kim real quick. Hey, Kim, you want to mod for us, man? As he comes up, would you like to mod for us?
Sure, I'll mod for you.
All right, cool.
I'll
And
mute
so Lisa
myself.
and Erica, as Kim kind of does his part, if you want to jump on, and Kim, anytime you say, hey, I'm time out on me, let me know, and I'll switch you up. Is that cool? Awesome. So, folks, we'll get started in a little bit. Just a few housekeeping. Again, we're going to do a one-on-one format. I have questions for Liam. I'll go through his bio. We'll field questions from the chat. So if you got your questions, Kim's going to field those for us, and then I'll periodically go back and forth just to make it a fluid conversation. What we'll also do is if anyone's spewing hate rhetoric or is trolling, we're gonna mute you and block you, and you can't. We're just not going to tolerate that. I won't tolerate it as the host. It's not productive. We can't move forward. And so just FYI. So we'll give it another 5 minutes. Share the live. Would love for you to invite your friends. And I'll give you a little perspective on who Liam is. A professor of history focused on the evolution of systems of thought and regionally on the Middle East and Europe. Started college at the age of 30, and so ran through his PhD after being a longshoreman in the port of LA. So you're a longshoreman, Liam.
Yep.
Now,
I have a solid working class pedigree. No one in my family had ever gone to college before.
wow.
I jumped in and went straight through to a PhD, so clearly insane.
Were you invited to become a longshoreman in LA, or was that just you worked your way up?
I was fourth generation. My great grandfather is one of the founders of the ILWU.
Wow.
So yeah, the fact that my father was down there for 50 years is how I initially got in, but my grandfather was down there and my great grandfather was down there.
That's so cool. It's interesting because when I worked in the banks in that area, I got an invitation for a ticket to go, and I just stuck I stuck with financial services, and just
it's gotten harder and harder to get in too.
I imagine.
You have to show up as a casual just every day, checking in twice a day, hoping to get work. And if there's no work for you, then you just go home. But because you're stuck going down there, it's hard to have another job.
Oh,
so
yeah.
It's one of the ways I got out of I ended up getting into a few other things. I started doing a lot of freelance computer work at the same time because I was always tearing machines apart and whatnot. So I ended up getting into doing like network installs, network security audits, crap like that, because it was something I could balance the time better with, rather than a full-time job and trying to work at the port. And then when that ended up doing well enough, I ended up doing that for a few years. My last position before I jumped back into college was a network manager at a small aerospace company in Long Beach.
Very cool. Yeah, I worked in Long Beach for from 2003 to 2006. And it's a funny story how I got there.
Someone says, do you speak Hebrew? Ani mevin kitzarivit. I follow well enough. I don't productively speak often enough. I studied a bunch of languages mainly to read. So I get by reading in quite a few languages.
Awesome.
But asking me to have a conversation, even in ones that I've been studying for most of my life, is hard. Language acquisition was always strange for me anyway, though, just as an autistic person. So,
and I was gonna share that in addition to you were a truck driver, fried cook. You talked about being a network system administrator at aerospace.
Yep.
You talked about this quite a bit and openly, and I love the vulnerability around it. Hyperactive and autistic, introverted, but you don't come across as introverted.
I was definitely a strange kid.
I think we're all strange at one point, but I love the fact there's a lot of folks coming, that are coming up and talking about the things that make them vulnerable, and that's important to remind people of, right?
Yeah, we're all human, and we all have our challenges. There there are some things that I'm really good at. Like I have no problem quoting crap I read 20 years ago, but I struggle a lot in some basic social shit that people tend to take for granted. It just takes a lot of effort.
Yep.
So, I mean, I still go and do tons of crap. Like I'm doing an in-person teaching in San Diego on Wednesday.
Uh-huh.
So I'll be down there, and it's a big ass auditorium. There's hundreds of people and blah blah blah, and like it's fine. It's just showing up to a new place with a bunch of new people. I have to kind of like
Take a deep breath.
Oh yeah, this is gonna be weird. But
Yeah, no, I don't doubt it. And you, in addition
fine.
to that, hyperlexic, bibliophilic, existentialist, anarchist, monist. You gave me and cat loving. I'm just gonna finish
Well,
with
you
cat
just asked
loving,
for things about
semi-hermit, living
they're
on
all
the
just,
mountain.
whatever. Yeah.
I love that. And so you work at two different universities, and you don't have to get into which ones, but otherwise, lover of science fiction, fantasy. Now, books, movies. Tell me about the fiction and the fantasy.
Yeah. For me, I read a ton of classic fiction when I was younger,
Yeah.
because it helped to teach me a lot about, stupid human tricks, like, because I'm like, what is this crazy planet I got dropped on? These people make no sense. So I read tons and tons of fiction there, but I kind of lost a feel for a lot of it as I got older. And mainly I read nonfiction. I read nonfiction very quickly. I'm very comfortable staying in that world. But when I want fiction stuff, it's like hard science fiction or epic fantasy. I like the more complex stuff. So
Got it.
really good world building. So yeah, obviously your classic Tolkien type stuff, but like the Malazan Book of the Fallen from Stephen Erickson is great. It kind of like sucks you in because he's an
Love it.
anthropologist. So kind of lays out a very long-term history for the world, which is like, oh yeah, that's kind of neat. So,
And I was going to ask you. Look, I don't ever make assumptions. Anybody I'm meeting. So all those big books behind you, have you read all those?
this is nothing. There are 52 bookcases in this house.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, they're like every like little bits of height ceilings. Like there's spots here above the closet, and then there's a few extra feet there. So I jammed small bookcases up there, like every possible space. Like
That's awesome.
if there's a little bit of space next to a window, I made shelves to fit there. There's shelves over the windows.
Good for you.
It's every possible place. And so yeah, I mean, nonfiction. I read very fast.
Let me ask you, because I often talk to my kids. I have 4 kids, and the importance of reading. My oldest read extensively. My younger child is starting to read more. What was important? What did you extract from your reading journey?
Reading in general, like
Just in
life,
general.
child
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah, just in general. What did you extract from the learning?
Well, it gave me a profound sense of curiosity and connection. It introduced me to tons of things that I would never have run into otherwise. There's just so many interesting, I don't know, whole new worlds out there. It's not just
Sure.
reading like something fiction, but being introduced to cosmology or something. Like reading Carl Sagan books as a kid. Was just great. It just sucked me in. Like, oh wow, there's so much more to learn. So
I love that. Yeah,
yeah, there's.
I think there's so much you can extract from that. What people's cultural worldviews, and every now and then you need to take some time to read your fiction, and I think there's a good balance of that. And I love to hear that you can go in different spaces and really extract information, knowledge. And like you said, you have a recall memory that's just jumps out right at you, right? And I've heard you speak in the things that you've shared. Most people won't remember. At least I don't. I have to take notes.
Yeah, for me, it tends to be relatively relational, and I'm not great with super open-ended questions. But when somebody hits something and I know where they're after, yeah, I can dive into and run with anything. So yeah, I kind of enjoy that about lecturing too, because you never know what students are going to ask, and it's fun. And what I try to do is bounce off from that question and kind of like weave it into where we're talking about, or bring in different examples or something. So it's a lot of fun.
Well, it makes the conversation fluid, organic.
My memory for this kind of stuff is really good. My memory for what I had for breakfast is not.
Along that line, so we talked about kind of your education and prior to becoming a professor. You and I talked about your experience in the Middle East and Europe. Talk to the people in the chat and me about what sort of work did you do in the Middle East and Europe, and how many years were you involved?
I've spent a lot of summers over there. I'd have to really think to know how many, but I I was doing a lot of. I went in to do a few different projects. I spent summers doing intensive language studies, which is fun. Pardon me, because you get to do some on the ground. Jeez, some on the ground type stuff where you get to hear people walk around, get a sense of the culture as well, and not just do things from books, which is how I usually learn languages. So that was neat. So I worked on both my Arabic and my Hebrew over there. But I initially spent a couple of years doing a research study on, well, how do you put this quickly? Because there's two halves to it. Part of it is looking at some of the religious settlements in the West Bank, particularly the Haredi settlements in the West Bank, and their physical impact on the environment and on Palestinian space, but also looking at a lot of the Israeli sociological work on their changes. Because if you look at most, English language academic works on Haredim in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's always like, well, they're non-Zionists and they mostly just live in the West Bank if it's cheaper or whatever, and that they're not really connected into this, and that's not really the case anymore. I've been in a lot of places where Haredim come out waving Israeli. Who doesn't know? So Haredim, like the ultra orthodox, the guys in the black coats and the hats, and
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you.
Very very traditional Orthodox Jews. And historically, they were not really connected to the Zionist project, but they increasingly have been since the Intifadas. And that's something I think we need to take a lot more seriously, because it's not just the ideological religious Zionist settlers or the secular Zionist settlers in the West Bank, but now increasingly large numbers of Haredim that also care passionately about it and are increasingly joining the IDF and whatnot. So I was looking at that for a while, and then in the 2011 and 2012, I actually got sucked into the Arab uprisings. I was one of those people that had been talking for quite a long time that this shit's inevitable because you can't keep people down forever. They know they're being screwed. They can see what's going on in the world,
right?
So I was at like Gezi Park protests in Turkey and like the Occupy protests in Israel, and I was in Tahrir Square, from Mubarak's fall, and that was a lot of fun. I got to meet a lot of activists and pick up tons of their stories and like what is it like to struggle for basic dignity and freedom in countries that don't have it. I mean, granted, the U.S. has been steadily losing it for a long time, but we used to have rather a lot. And certainly not like growing up in an outright military dictatorship. So it was sort of those are the two main projects that I spent time on studying there, in addition to just practical work in languages.
I don't want to gloss over that, because in order to be engrossed in the culture and understanding the different perspectives really adds value to the messaging. And so I don't want to pivot from that too much. But before we do, I think Kim, there's a question there. If we could just keep it for Syrian, we'll get to it in a second. We often have conversations on these different panels about the establishment of Palestine. And I want to set some, I want to kind of build a foundation around that and ask some questions around that. So if you were to describe to the audience the history of Palestine and sources they can reference, right, from the name, and you can go back as far as you'd like, what would you share? Just from an educational perspective, what would you share?
It might be a little too open-ended, given I literally wrote and teach a class on 4,000 years of history in that region, because for dealing with the modern conflict, I like establishing some of the longue durée, the longer term occupation in the land and the roots that people have on it. If you can go back to the beginning, and you can see that these cultures build up from the Stone Age on, and that tons of different cultures just slowly evolve out of what's there. What will become eventually Judaism evolves out of the Canaanite cultures. What eventually becomes the Palestinian culture evolves out of the Canaanite culture. They've always been there. But if you can trace that for people and then pay attention not only to the history and anthropology on that, but also to their myths, to their own sense of self, what they believe about themselves.
Right.
Because frequently what we believe about ourselves is more important than what's actually true, because what our beliefs are what motivate our actions.
Sure.
So giving a sense of both of those really helps by the time you get into the early modern period and people are starting to develop modern political identities, and it shows you what they can draw on, what are the pieces that they pick up from, and how do they use them. So
No,
even it's such a long period of, I'm not sure what you'd want me to.
no, that's good. I think you mentioned a couple things that really resonate. I think, our self-belief.
Interesting question there.
determines-
Somebody asked about, okay, so who
Go
was
ahead.
there?
You feel them as you see them too.
Who was there before Canaanites? Because
Go ahead.
that culture just evolved on the spot. I mean, we have Neolithic sites there, what we tend to call like the Natufian culture is one of the oldest there, and that's going back 12,000 some years. So there's settlements that are in there. Some places, actually, Jericho has been continuously inhabited for 11,000 years, but the Canaanite culture was only about 4,000 years back. So they weren't Canaanite. They originally had completely different languages and cultural identities. We don't really know where the Semitic language family comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And there's two possibilities there. One is that migrants coming up carried in the Semitic language, and then the language shifted in the area. That happens a lot of times. Frequently, cultures adopt a language without them being replaced. So think about all the populations were sort of Latinized and developed the Romance languages, right? Or like, the Hungarian language in the center of Europe. I mean, genetically, they're just like the rest of the South Slavic people, but, a small number of Magyars came in and they passed their language on. So
Right.
It could be like that. So the ancestral language of what becomes the Canaanite languages could have come in from migrants, or it could actually have been indigenous to the Levant and spread outward from there to Mesopotamia and down into Arabia. There's the evidence on this is still really, really fragmentary. It's difficult to reconstruct ancient linguistic evolution, but either way, what eventually gives us like a distinct Canaanite identity, we can only when we have the language family has taken root and the writing system is developed. What they were before, we tend to just name these different cultures based upon pottery types or certain locations or whatever, because we're digging it up archaeologically. We have no idea what the hell they call themselves. But the people who became the Canaanites were there for thousands of years before they became Canaanites.
Great. I love it. I want to pause and Kim, do you have, I know Liam fielded some questions. Do you have any questions that I didn't catch or Liam didn't catch that you'd like to ask from the chat?
I haven't fielded any yet. I'm looking for them.
Okay.
Abu Daoud's been bogarting the chat, but I'll keep looking.
Okay. I did see one earlier, and I'm not sure. We'll ask it since we're looking for some. Someone said, "What are your thoughts about Elon being in Israel today?"
The short would be I don't have any. But Musk himself, I could rant forever on.
Sure.
I mean, the dude has a serious anti-Semitic and racist streak in him, but he's also really, really prone to far-right rhetoric and nationalist rhetoric. So I can understand why he would be more sympathetic to the Israeli side. Nationalists all tend to kind of like each other. There's a lot of ways in which I think Musk being an apartheid baby really stuck with him.
Got it. Black historian, go ahead. Black historian, your question was, can you explain to the people that people were there before the land was named?
You explain to people that. Well, I was. If that's what I was just talking about in terms of the names for it, yeah, there was always people there. What becomes the Canaanites, what eventually becomes the Israelite and Judahite cultures, they evolved out of these earlier cultures there. Same with the Palestinian population. There's always occasional small admixtures of people. People pass through areas, sometimes they settle in, but most of the population, this is where it's fun to bring in not only archaeology and anthropology and history, but a little bit of genetics. If you look at, we've dug up 5,000-year-old skeletons that still have viable DNA in them, taken out and sequenced it, and found out that modern Lebanese, modern Palestinians, and modern Israelis all share the same Levantine bits. There's a core that's present in all three populations, noting that original origin. So despite the fact that Jews had scattered around the world and intermarried in tons of places, they carried a lot of that with them. And despite the population staying behind and other peoples constantly coming through the area, that core stays there with them as well. So it's the same kind of like weird mixed up bit. But the names just come from different languages along the way, you know? A lot of the names we have for them, I mean, okay, so Canaanite actually comes out of their language. Kanani is actually from their Semitic tongue, and it's very similar to the one that you get in the Bible for them. But we also frequently call them Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians and Canaanites are exactly the same people. So when you get Lebanese people talking about, we were ancient Phoenicians, that's literally exactly the same ancestors as the Palestinians had. They're the same people. So names are funny that way. One name that we do get for Palestine later does come from people that settle on the coast briefly and then later just get assimilated. That's the Philistines.
Got it. Thank you.
Philistine culture is not technically indigenous itself, but it's a very small chunk of people. They settled in there in the process of the Bronze Age collapse when tons of people running around, because everything's falling apart. The Hittites collapsed. Egypt went through hell. I mean, everything's just going nuts. And some of them ended up there, and then they just assimilated, after a number of generations and became Canaanites too. But they left their name behind, and that name has been resurrected a few times in different ways. But it's still ultimately exactly the same people.
Awesome. One of the things that is important for us to share is resources. If you were to recommend a couple of resources for people, what would you recommend?
Resources on what?
Books to read, articles about what you just discussed. Give me two, because I know there's probably a ton of them out there.
I'm terrible at that, honestly. For me, when people want book recommendations, I have to talk to them about what their specific interest is.
Got it.
Because my first impulse is like, here's a stack. These are all good. And I have no way of knowing what you find more valuable or will work for you, because my ideas are all a giant syncretic blend of them. It's just a giant synthesis over time. There's nothing that comes from any one place. It's one of the reasons I'm trying to finish my own book on 4,000 years in the area. But there's no single one. But if anybody follows me and, sends me little messages there, I can talk to them about their interests, what they're most interested in. And chances are good I've read something along the lines of what they're looking for, and I can recommend that then.
Awesome. Then you guys heard him. So if you want to follow, hit a follow for Liam, and he does share a ton of information. Kim, any new questions that come up from the chat before?
There was one I saw a minute ago about the term anti-Semitic.
Yes.
Which would be a good one, because this is actually it's an interesting one, because a lot of people respond to the question of anti-Semitism and try to say, well, Arabs speak a Semitic language, so then if you don't like Arabs, you're anti-Semitic. And there's a real problem with that. I understand the impulse, but there's a problem with it. It has nothing to do with some kind of Jewish nationalist thing here. Anti-Semitism is a bullshit term made up by racists in Europe. They had a traditional Christian theological basis for hating Jews, but as Europe was secularizing more and becoming more and more scientific, a lot of people, they grew up in a Lutheran or Catholic culture, and of course they grew up hating Jews, right? There's just Jew hatred all over, but they can't cling to the theological bases for it anymore. So they invented a bullshit pseudo-scientific term for it. They made Jews a race, which they're not. That's not how this shit works. And they picked out Semitic because people at the time in the late 18th and 19th century were studying language families and documenting language families. Like, it's a Semitic language. But the Jews of Europe didn't speak a Semitic language. Mm-hmm. What would make you a Semite is being a native speaker of a Semitic language. So Ethiopians are Semitic, and Eritreans are Semitic, and people in Saudi and Iraq, they're Semitic, or most Iraqis, not all. But most Jews historically were not. So the term anti-Semitism has literally nothing to do with, it can't be a racial identity because racism is bullshit anyway, but it was a racist label. And it has nothing to do with the language that you speak, because those Jews didn't speak a Semitic language. So we can't really say it's anti-Semitism to hate Arabs, because anti-Semitism is literally just a pseudo-scientific stand-in word for Judenhass, for Jew hatred. It's something specific to European history and the fact that Europeans had a real problem with Jews. And it just transitions from like the theological bases to a weird nationalistic racist basis later. But rather than trying to extend it outward and say, hey, we're all Semites, let's all be Semites together, why cling to a racist label in the first place? It's like, you're like rushing, please be racist towards me. Like, why can't we just say race is fucking stupid and just get rid of this shit?
Well, the way you explain it, I mean, it provides some clarity. I think we've had these discussions on several panels, but the way you've explained it makes sense. And I think the Black historian asked another question. I'm not sure you could see it. Did we answer your question around how anti-Semite applied to religion or ethno-religion and not the language or the indigenous people?
There's something about, where is that at?
You see this one?
How anti-Semitic applied to religion or ethno-religion. Yeah, exactly. It was never about the language families. And that's why trying to apply it now to speakers of those language families just doesn't make a lot of sense. It originally was distinctly a racist term because French people didn't want there to be French Jews. They wanted to say, you're a Jew, not a French Jew or a Frenchman, right? Nationalism works around exclusions. It creates like groups and outgroups, and you choose different characteristics that you want to be part of that. And every European national identity always excluded Judaism from it, as well as Jewish ancestry in most cases. So if your parents were Jews, it was problematic. So really, it's much better to kind of like just get over this shit and stop hating people for bullshit racial reasons that were invented in the 19th century.
Makes sense. I'm not sure what this Jew lover says. I'm going to pass that. I'm not sure what that's all about. But I wanted to come to you and talk a little bit about, move in terms of timeline. We've been on these panels quite a bit, and I've been trying to stay as informed as possible. And the two things I want to tackle, and I think I sent you this around the Oslo 1 and Oslo 2, and I've read why they weren't successful, but I'd love your perspective to share with the audience on Oslo, because oftentimes, there was an agreement given between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This side didn't want it. This side didn't want it. What would you say as the major impact or adverse impact that those two resolutions had, 1 and 2?
I think my answer here is my answer here might surprise some people. The Oslo Accords did exactly what they were intended to do. They worked perfectly. From the Israeli perspective, they were never intended to result in a Palestinian state, and no Palestinian state was ever offered at any point in the process. What it did was it extracted concessions from them at the time that it started. At the time the Madrid process, just before Oslo started, the PLO had basically screwed itself in any number of ways. Most recently by backing Saddam Hussein in the Gulf crisis. So they had nothing left. Every bit that they'd tried to do in terms of militant resistance had failed. All the earlier attempts at diplomatic efforts had failed. They picked the wrong side and alienated some of their few remaining backers. So basically, Arafat came crawling on hands and knees, please give us something. And for that, he recognized Israel as a state.
Mm-hmm. I remember that.
Recognized that Palestinians exist as people and stopped pretending, for the most part, they stopped pretending that they were just Arabs like any other Arab. But there's nothing in the documentation ever or any statement that recognizes Palestinians' right to self-determination. Nothing was ever offered. What it does was it carves it up into small territories, gives little bits of autonomy. And honestly, the goal of giving Palestinians that are still there some kind of local autonomy was present in Zionist literature going back to the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, you can see this in like Jabotinsky's Iron Wall essay from 1922, that the idea is keep your boot on the neck until they finally say, okay, we'll just take whatever we can get, and then give them some autonomy, and that's it, but not actually self-determination, because the goal was to never have any other sovereign state between the Jordan and the Mediterranean.
Liam, can you just pause for a second? Let's go ahead and block Abu Daoud. Look, we're trying to inform here, and so we have a PhD providing information, so let's just go ahead and block him. Sorry about that, Liam. Continue, please, because I think it's important.
People love to call BS without actually reading the fucking documents. I mean, they literally say it. I mean, it's you pretending that words aren't what words are. It's just bizarre to me.
He was
But
trolling the
get
entire time, and I gave him a little bit of latitude. And at this
I
point, I
get
said,
the
you know what?
emotional reasons people do it. You know
Yeah.
that oftentimes if you're strongly committed to a particular idea, it's very difficult to let that go and take anything else in.
Yeah.
I often tell people, just don't bother. If somebody is really committed to a particular idea, it's not worth your time. Maybe somebody who's really close to them personally can get through, but
Sure.
talk to people who haven't fallen down that rabbit hole yet. They're the ones you can actually make some progress with.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And I think one of the things that resonated with me in reading the Oslo One and hearing about it was the fact that both, I think, conceded at the reluctance of their parties. Arafat wanted to stay in power. Yitzhak had an issue with, and you validate this for me, one of his biggest issues were the settlements at that time were about 115,000. He struggled with having those removed. How much of that is true?
There was no desire to remove them. During the 1990s, the settler population literally doubled.
Yeah.
They under Rabin, even before he was out of the picture, settlement construction massively expanded. The people tend to forget that Rabin was present in the 1948 war and literally oversaw significant parts of the ethnic cleansing in the Nakba. And he was a war hawk. You know, when it came to like things like the 67 war that were totally unnecessary, all their own analysts, U.S. analysts, everyone said, the Egyptians are not going to attack you, bro. You're not really threatened here. This is just people beating their chests. You know, you can find a diplomatic solution. But the Israelis wanted a war because they wanted to annex more territory. Rabin was hardcore about trying to take the West Bank still at that point. So he simply inherited a bigger problem because in 47, 48, they could drive a lot of people over the border. At that point, they really couldn't anymore. So they're stuck like, okay, now what? Now that we've like raced and grabbed all of historic Palestine for ourselves, and now what? So it's more a matter of, from Rabin's perspective, of resurrecting that old idea of granting a certain level of autonomy to what is essentially a subject or colonized people, so that they can have some dignity, but not actual national self-determination.
Just really quickly, I think it goes into the question G asked, why did right-wing Zionists assassinate Isaac Rabin? I would assume it goes into that.
It's because he was even talking to them. And part of it is that there's always a lot of misdirection about what people's actual positions were. I mean, the official state line, for example, in 67 was that they were threatened, and they kept saying, it'll be another Holocaust, we're really threatened. They knew they weren't. All their documents said that they weren't. Everyone knew that they weren't, but they said it, which means it becomes a part of the national imaginary. So a lot of the understandings of people like Ben Gurion and Rabin are not quite what you would really expect if you actually look at what they're doing and saying. And when he's talking to people like Arafat, who is a terrorist, he was fighting back. He was fighting for land, trying to hold a piece of it. For people who are committed to the idea of holding every part of that land at all costs, you know, because this is, I mean, and for anybody who doesn't know, the West Bank is the biblical heartland. Much of where 1948 Israel is doesn't really have much biblical history. It's not really that significant. Most of the important archaeological and historical sites are in the West Bank. So if you start giving, even if it's not independence, even if it's autonomy to another population in that area, it really rubs nationalists the wrong way. So,
and I want to draw on that a little bit.
That's where Biden got a target on his head.
I want to. Kim, was there anything else you wanted to ask before I
know.
There was just one more question. I think it was just regarding like any books that you could recommend regarding the political history of Israel.
Political history, like it's internal politics or it's diplomatic history.
It was a
relation to other states.
Pretty open-ended question. I think.
Yeah, that does get harder and harder.
Like,
the simplest thing I'll say is, as I'll repeat the same thing. Follow me, send me a direct message. We'll talk about your interests. Almost certainly I have something along the lines of what you want.
Awesome.
But if I don't know what somebody wants, my first impulse is to name 24 things, and no one wants to hear that shit. There's a lot of really good political history. I mean, Avi Shlaim is really good for that. He's a diplomatic historian.
Say that name again, Liam.
Avi Shlaim.
Obviously,
So,
okay.
oh gosh,
I I can type it in the chat, or maybe Kim, would you mind typing that in the chat? Uh,
Yeah,
This is a
let
this,
me
this is distinctly a political
obviously.
history. So it deals a lot of like with some of the internal political structure, the horse trading inside, but also their relations to all the Arab states and whatnot.
awesome. I do have a question. I want to go back for a second, and then maybe we'll come to you again in a little bit, Kim. One of the things we often talk about is the Balfour Agreement in 1948 with Lord Rothschild. Would you mind walking us through that agreement? Who was involved? Who was not involved? And what's your perspective on that? I've had people on panels dismiss the Nakba, but I wanted to.
We might be a little crossed here. So 48 and Nakba go together. Balfour is 1917.
Yeah, just so not so far in 1917. So in that agreement, what was its ties to 1948? Let me just pose it that way. Does that make sense?
How does Balfour connect to the 48 bit?
Yes.
Oh, geez.
Thank
Well,
you.
the simplest way to look at that is to note that while the structure of the British Mandate in Palestine was on paper intended to create an Arab country that would join the League of Nations, they baked into it the idea that it was also a national home for Jews. So from the British perspective, it wasn't written out as this will be a Jewish state that will exclude Palestinians. It was like this will be a Palestinian state that will include Jews. And they dramatically encouraged a lot of immigration. And we have to remember the context of high imperialism. And in the 1920s and 30s, you're still in the high imperial. Oh, I got a hat. You're still in the high imperial period. And during that, the colonial powers liked to find a population locally that they can work with. So that's where you get a lot of divide and rule tactics and things like that, or like partly assimilating certain areas. So like when the French went into Algeria, they sent in missionaries to like talk to the Jewish population of Algeria, and then those Algerian Jews who were Arabs before, Arabs and Berbers, gradually became more francophone. So it started creating divisions there. But you're looking for a population you can work with, and the idea of bringing a whole bunch of European Jews to Palestine would make the area easier to control. So that's their goal there. The problem here is that they really underestimated the kind of ethnic nationalism that was building up there amongst the Zionists. So as the population shot up in the 20s and 30s, by the time you get to the mid-1930s, and this is where I really take people to task when they say, oh, the international system like the US, whatever, we created Israel because of World War II. It's bullshit. The creation of the state of Israel was inevitable by the mid-1930s. No matter what anybody had done. I mean, even if they had to wage a war of liberation against the British and drive them out by force, they would have. And they were already in the process of doing so. And there was constant terror attacks against, British forces, from the early 1930s all the way through until the end of the mandate. So their goal was to create a state for themselves, period. And once enough people were on the ground, they had the ability to do so. So by the time you get to Nakba, so getting to your question.
Yep.
So while the British Mandate is still there, and this is where World War II is relevant, is it does affect international opinion on this whole matter, and the degree to which people are willing to say, you know what, I guess they have a right to be like super nationalistic because look what we just did to them. We just fucked them over royally. I mean, they have a right to be angry, So people just kind of like gave it a pass in a sense, and Britain in particular, realizing that it had completely screwed the pooch here, it had created like a small territory with two distinct national identities that couldn't get along, because especially by the early 20th century, the Zionists were increasingly not interacting with the Palestinian population. They were creating a parallel society. So you've got two different people that don't interact much on the same land that both want it. And Britain realized, okay, we screwed up. So turns it over to the UN, says if they can figure it out.
Right.
But what the UN proposed never went into effect at all. And 6 months before Britain's mandate expired, because the mandate was set to expire in May of 48, you already have ethnic cleansing operations taking place in December of 47. By the time you get to 48, people are always like saying that A lot of the expulsions and whatnot came about because of the Arab armies and the context of the 1948 war. But the 1948 war came onto the scene 6 months later, after 200,000 people had already lost their homes. They were already pushed over the borders. So Britain was basically, its soldiers were just told to stand down. There are times when there was like shooting fights between Palestinians and Zionists, and they're just like standing there going,
kind of a hands-off. It's a hands-off approach.
Because they knew if they got in, they had the ability to do something about it. They had the resources. They were still a large power. They were much weaker after World War II. But again, this is two relatively small populations in a relatively minor area. They could have kept control over it. They chose not to. And think what you will of that or the reasons for it, but they didn't want, the main thing is they didn't want to get caught up in a very expensive process after World War II, because they were struggling to hold on to their empire. They were already having to negotiate like the loss of South Asia and everything else. This is just, they didn't want to deal with that shit. And there was a sense that if they did anything else to intervene, the whole world would hate them because of the Holocaust. As it was, their 1939 white paper that tried to restrict Jewish migration came about just before World War II started. And we all know what the Nazis got up to during World War II.
Right.
So they knew this would be bad press for them and more expensive than they wanted. So they just stood by while 200,000 people were driven over the borders. So by the time the Declaration of Independence came, and some Arab states got involved, and that involvement is really, really weak. That's a whole different story, though. They did almost nothing. But by the time they got involved, the process was well underway, and no one had any real ability to stop it. So, so connecting it to your earlier statement about how does the British policies in Balfour lead toward this, it's allowing for quite some time completely unrestricted migration. I think it's worth noting that in the 1920s, Britain already knew that they'd screwed up. They had two different white papers produced. Like, you guys know what white papers are? Like
of 1939. Yeah.
No, before this. So like,
please enlighten us.
So like the Passfield white paper I'm thinking of. And then there was a follow-on from that too, because when the Passfield was done, they pointed out that Zionist policies and the segregation between the societies, the parallel societies, the way they were treating people was creating a ton of resentment that was going to spill over into violence and riots and whatnot, and was going to create a completely ungovernable territory. They knew that. They got a report. White papers are produced by government commissions. You put a bunch of nerds together, they study a problem, they come up with a proposal to solve it. Their proposal to solve it was like, we should really slow down this Zionist migration and find some way to integrate the populations. And, we can't deal with that politically. So they called another commission to study the same thing. And they came up with exactly the same answer.
Hands off.
Just shelved it again and waited another decade. So this is in 1929. So by the time the 1939 white paper comes about, they've spent 20 years letting as many people come in as they want, even though they knew there was a problem. That's how they're kind of responsible for what ends up happening in Nakba. That's the link I would make there is Britain completely screwed the pooch on this. Not entirely intentionally, but more because they were trying to balance conflicting interests, and there was no way to actually do that because of what the Zionists actually wanted.
Got it. Appreciate that. Kim, I see some questions. Did you see anything, Liam, that you wanted to tackle before we moved on? And Kim?
I did see one question.
Hearing questions,
I did see
talking,
one.
I'm not gonna see it. Oh, somebody scratched.
Go ahead, Kim.
I did see one question I thought was a good point to bring up. Someone asked who was responsible for arming the original settlers, like the original Israeli people that were there. Was there anyone giving them weapons? Was it Britain?
So then before the state, you mean?
Before the state, yeah. I guess the original settlements.
Most of themselves. What the first wave of migrants didn't have much of anything, and a lot of them didn't even stay in the land. They struggled to make a living there. But by the time you get into the second, third, fourth aliyot, you have international organizations, the Jewish Colonization Association, the World Zionist Jewish Colonization Society, the World Zionist Organization. There's different groups that are. See, yeah, when we're talking about like the Czechs and whatnot, this is all much later. Earlier on, it's these different organizations. They're raising money. This is where there's a distinction between it gets a little didactic, but there's a distinction between practical Zionism and political Zionism. Practical Zionism is, I'm going to pick up and move to Palestine. Political Zionism is, I really support that. Here's some money I'm going to donate to support the cause. So you're raising money, you're raising awareness, you're picking up all the support, and they're buying supplies. And so it's a lot of small arms. The number of small arms that they have goes up a little bit during the mid-1930s when they start collaborating more with the British. Because paramilitaries, usually governments don't want to deal with paramilitaries. They're kind of like keeping an eye on them. Like, they're like, oh, we got these weird militias in Idaho. Should we keep an eye on these people? You usually don't want to, like, give them badges or something. But in the mid-1930s, in the Arab Revolt in 36, Britain started collaborating extensively with Haganah, and Haganah started stealing guns from them. And in addition, a number of people, enlisted to fight in World War I, and then again, people fought in World War II, so you got military veterans. But it's really not until the creation of the state itself that any kind of heavy weapons can be purchased. They had no access to planes, artillery. They had nothing early on. It's tons of small arms, right? So rifles, a few mortars, lots of pistols, things like that. The kind of stuff that people can basically
enough to make an impact.
Enough to make an impact. So in many ways, the 1948 fight is actually Israel's hardest. They had an overwhelming advantage as it was, though, because even if you count in the Palestinians there, and as well as the contingents from 6 Arab states, just the existing paramilitaries already outnumbered all of those armies combined, and that's without calling up any reservists. So they had a manpower advantage, and they had better training because they had veterans of 2 world wars. The Arabs had nothing comparable. But it was all fought with small arms, which means that it was a slow process for them.
Got it.
Once they were able to get equipment, that creates a massive material advantage as well. But early on, their advantage was in organization, it was in training, and was in just drive, like the ideology. We are going to do this. They were fighting for a cause. They wanted a country at all costs. So, you got to respect the hustle in a sense,
Got it. So just a quick commercial break into the chat. We're only fielding today. Kim's moderating. So Kim, how you doing on moderation? You good, buddy?
I'm good.
Okay, cool. We're just fielding questions from the chat. It just makes it easier for flow. Otherwise, I'd have to bring up a lot of people. So Ham, I see you, brother. If you have a question, feel free to ask. I'm gonna just go back here.
There's the 2 last things are neat, actually.
Go for it. Take them.
The Jordanian military was actually by far the most professional military that the Arab world had in 48, which is interesting to think about because Jordan is a dirt-poor desert country. But they had by far the best military, largely because the Hashemite monarchy was a proxy for the UK, and they trained them and armed them and whatnot. And in 48, they actually had British officers leading their contingent. So the Arab Legion out of Jordan, they knew what the hell they were doing, which is why their decision to collude with the Zionists in advance and not actually get involved in the fighting directly, that ends up being a real... The only real fighting they got involved in was around Jerusalem. Beyond that, they mostly stayed out of the fight, and it left it to far less professional forces to actually play out there. But they were better off. Somebody had also asked a question about land ownership, but I don't know if you want to go to there, but I saw that.
we could take that. And if there's another one, I want to come back to Curly's, but I think someone asked the question about how do we combat
anti-Semitic accusations. I think that's
Liam
what
addressed
prevents
that.
a lot of people from.
Well, I addressed the
speaking
definition
out.
of it.
I don't know.
Do you want to take that one again before we get to the land ownership from?
If I understand the question, and I guess Kim can clarify this if I'm getting it wrong, but it's how do you deal with the accusation if you're criticizing Israeli policy and somebody calls you an anti-Semite? Is that what you mean?
Correct. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's right
that-
there.
that-
As it
that's
relates
where
to
it
their
comes
work, because they're afraid if they voice their concerns, they're considered anti-Semitic, and their job might be at risk.
The problem, it can be at risk because again, companies can do whatever the hell they want.
Especially in the U.S., you're an at-will employee, so
Yeah. So, but it still doesn't mean it's anti-Semitic. You can fight back, but still, best thing you can do is sue for wrongful termination and put together a really, really good brief. Get some experts and sue, and you can. I will testify in court for you. You'll win, but you can get fired for sure. The key here is that anti-Semitism is literally a form of racism from 19th century Europe based upon national identities. So if you hate Jews as a race of people, like you don't like Jewish people, I don't want Jews around, ooh, that's anti-Semitism, right? But disliking a country's policies has fuck all to do with anti-Semitism. Even disliking a country, actually, if somebody wants to say they're completely anti-Zionist, they don't want Israel to exist at all, that still technically isn't anti-Semitic, unless you're saying all the Jews should be like inferior second-class citizens or like in camps or some other bullshit there. Like if you want to return them to some of their previous status in Europe where they weren't citizens, that you're talking about anti-Semitic shit. But if you're talking about politics, Zionism is not a race of people. It's just not. Realistically, I don't think you have to be opposed to, because again, there's different forms of Zionism, and many forms of Zionism actually could coexist with Palestinians. And there were people talking about binationalism from the start. They were unfortunately a minority voice, but there were leftists, there were tons of liberals, there were people who wanted to say, "Hey, we want to come here, but you're cool here too." But opposition to the more exclusionary trends in Zionism, opposition to the ethno-nationalism in Israel, opposition to the ethnocratic policies of Israel, that cannot be anti-Semitic by definition, unless you're also hating me. If you're like, Liam, I hate you because you're Jewish. Okay, then we've got a problem. Then now you're an anti-Semite. But that's not the same thing.
Hopefully that helps facts over Liz. The other question was from Curly about land ownership in 47. You want to tackle that one?
Oh, Benito, the key there is, if you only oppose, but the one distinction here is that Israel's current governing structure is ethnocratic, which would be then akin to, say, not opposing the existence of South Africa as a country, but opposing the apartheid laws of South Africa. So there's an opposition to ethnocracy that you can take in there. If you want to take it farther and oppose nationalism as an idea, which I would, I'm an anti-nationalist, then I don't think France should exist as a country. I think the whole idea of dividing up into little countries ends up being bullshit, because even within them, they start forcibly assimilating different populations and crushing minorities. I mean, hell, France used to be extraordinarily diverse, dozen different languages, and now we're all French, and it's bullshit, I don't like any of that stuff. But as far as Israel, the key there is, and there is a distinction. I will make a point of clarification here, and this for any of my any Palestinian brothers or Arab brothers in the room here, please, this is an important point for you. A lot of people conflate Israeli and Jew and Zionist and Jew in some really, really harmful ways. So when someone's talking about what the Yehudi did and not the Israeli did, that's veering into anti-Semitic territory, because that shit includes me too. That includes a lot of people that had nothing to do with what you're talking about. And there is an unfortunate slow importation of anti-Semitic rhetoric from Europe into the Arab world, starting in the 19th century, that was never present there before. There were different problems that the Islamic world had with Jews. It's not at all the same as Europe, but they did have some issues of their own. They were definitely different, though. But specifically, European anti-Semitic discourses have been imported, and that conflation in terms and just referring to the Jews is itself a problem.
Thank you for clarifying that and diving deep into it. I think it's important for us to distinguish between the two. I do want to go back to Curly's question. And as Kim pulls up some stuff, Curly, I think your question, what was the land ownership in 1947? Okay. Liam, I'll turn it to you to give us your perspective.
Yeah, it's about 6% of the land. Now, granted, that's counting like the Negev. I mean, it's looking at all of mandatory Palestine, and who the hell cares about the Negev? But of the land in Palestine as a whole, Zionists own about 6% of it. It is a slightly larger percentage if you cut that half of the country off and look at just the arable land, but still, that's not much. So you're looking like 12 to 15% of the actual good usable land, because some of it was in really good areas and scattered across the Galil. If you looked at the 1947 UN partition plan, in the intended 56% of the territory that would have been a Jewish state, the land ownership was somewhere around 12%. So it is higher in there, but still it's not a majority of anything. It's still relatively low.
Got it. Curly, hopefully that answers your question. Let's see. We've got some discussion going back and forth. Do you see it? You see
There was
anything that
another
Liam you wanna
question.
address?
Sorry. There was another question quite a bit earlier. It was in regards to Herzl, I believe, if he is the true father of Zionism, or if that was an idea before Herzl, or
Yeah, it predates Herzl by decades. He converted to Zionism. Herzl is
Okay.
the founder of a specific type of Zionism. Herzl is the founder of political Zionism. Earlier Zionists, if you go back from like the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you're looking at practical Zionists, people that are preparing to move, that are like studying how to farm, learning the language, things like that, and then ready to move to Palestine. But the idea of turning to assimilated Jews in London and Berlin and raising money and political support for them, that's what Herzl did. And Herzl was a brilliant propagandist. He was a journalist, so he wrote well. So he plays a significant part in that. But thinking that he's somehow the founder of Zionism is just ahistorical. He did create a form of Zionism. But he initially, dude was totally assimilated himself. He thought that the solution for Jews was just to blend into European society. But then he started seeing more and more episodes of anti-Semitism. He was really kind of woken up by the Dreyfus affair in France, where, in the wake of the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, the French army looked for a scapegoat. And they just picked out this Jewish artillery captain, put him on trial in a military court with zero evidence. And he's like, what the fuck? Like, everyone knew there was no evidence. This could not have been done in a civilian court. But it kind of like woke him up to say, hey, maybe they don't want us. But he still cast about for a while looking for alternatives. At one point, he wrote to the Pope saying, hey, if you'll fund me, I'll convert all the Jews to Catholicism. And the Pope's like, yeah, dude, we tried that. It doesn't work. What are you talking about? So then he encountered Zionist writings. He's like, wait a minute, that's a cool idea. So, yeah,
Wow.
He came onto it quite late.
And so I've been under the understanding all this time that he was the father of Zionism. So
It's commonly said. It actually is a significant part of Israel's founding myths too, because especially since the earlier waves of migration didn't leave behind a whole lot, and in the first Aliyah, so like the 1882 to 1903, that group of people didn't come in with the same ideological considerations. They frequently found ways to accommodate the Palestinian population, work with them. They weren't taking land from them. They're like, oh shit, we bought land, but you already live here? Crap. Okay, we're going to build our village over there, and then you can keep working the land here. We'll find a way to like split the profits, and we'll all survive. It was much more of like a collaborative enterprise. Early 20th century, that begins to shift, and that begins to shift after Herzl. So in some ways, you can say, yeah, he's a founder of Zionism because he gives a specific spin to it. He takes it in a different direction. But Zionism literally predates Herzl by decades. It was around like 40 years before he got around to it.
Thank
so
you.
would you say that he sort of propagandized Zionism? Is that, I don't know if that's a
in a
classification.
sense, because he is a good journalist and he spread the idea. He got people in a lot of other countries to notice it. Zionism originally only appealed to people in Eastern Europe that were the most persecuted. So you've got people that are, being kicked around in tons of pogroms. It's a weird mix of like the racism and the traditional religious violence, and they're much more keen to get the hell out of Dodge. But Eastern Europe is much poorer. Before that, it was just coming out of feudalism, for fuck's sake, in the late 19th century. So nobody in Western Europe knew about it, and no one had any reason to care about it. Herzl brought it to them. So it shows up in Vienna because of Herzl. It shows up in London and Paris because of Herzl. But if you look at like Bucharest or Odessa, yeah, there were already plenty of Zionists.
Kim, did you have another question that you wanted to ask as well from the chat before I move on?
Someone had asked, it's not really having to do with history. It's sort of, it relates to the history. They said with all of this that's gone on, is peace really is that something that we can expect?
Yeah. Well, expect on current trajectories, no, because we're still always heading in the wrong directions.
Right.
The trick to any kind of peace is to unfuck ourselves here. Right? We have to think of these things differently. So if you reconceptualize Zionism in a way that says, hey, Jews deserve self-determination in a place that they can live in security, but it doesn't take anything away from anybody else, okay. And if you say Palestinians have an equal right to live here and equal dignity and there's no discrimination and everyone has a right to return and we'll build a country together, great. Then that would be a kind of peace. But that's not what Zionism means to most people. I mean, maybe a few people in Meretz or something. Like there's not many people that would take that perspective today. But that could be done. The key to any kind of peace solution is going to be to recognize the common humanity. At this point, the Israelis have to recognize that their actions over the last 140 years have created generational trauma among Palestinians and have caused significant problems for them. You know, tons of like historic violence, things like that. We have to deal with that because people growing up in those environments, that does damage to you. But the Palestinians then have to recognize that their reaction to that, even if they felt a legitimate right to resist, which they do, their actions actually play on Jewish generational traumas and 2 millennia of persecution. So it creates a sort of bunker mentality that says the whole world's out to get us and we have to double down on everything. And every time they double down on it, throw up the steel doors and reach out with a hammer, it just hurts the Palestinians again, which makes them want to poke back. So we've had this feedback loop going on for 100 years now. And if we manage to break that by recognizing the common humanity, okay, so there's a certain injustice in coming in the first place. They did some fucked up stuff. We got to come up with justice, a way to, restitution for that. Think about the question of like reparations in the U.S. for slavery and Jim Crow, or like the land back movement for, like recognizing treaty rights for Amerindians, things like that.
Do you feel that's possible though in Israel, reparations?
I think that, well, yeah, because it is actually a fairly wealthy country. It has the 17th highest living standard in the world, and other countries do have a vested interest in this. If the U.S. can give them $4 billion worth of guns every year, it can give $4 billion worth of direct economic aid to resettle Palestinians and build infrastructure. We could build a shit ton of desalination plants to make up for the fact that there's not enough water. You could do all kinds of things to completely revitalize this stuff if you were willing to invest. The key there is, but both populations have to recognize the common humanity and that they both have a right to live there.
Yep.
And then you start the long generations process of unfucking yourself, because it's going to, just like anywhere else, it takes generations for racist ideas to go away. And the Palestinians have developed plenty of reasons to want to drive Jews out, and the Israelis have had plenty of reasons to want to chase Palestinians out. I mean, people have these really weird ideas about each other because they've just never lived together. I mean, even in mixed cities, and I lived in Haifa for a while in northern Israel, and I don't know if anybody knows, Haifa is a little over a quarter Palestinian still. Although they're mostly concentrated in a few neighborhoods, so like Wadi Nisnas is Palestinian, most of the city is not. But I
used to drive into that town in the mid-90s.
Yeah, it's a beautiful city. I love a city on a hill. I've got a real fascination for places like San Francisco or whatever. I love a city on a hill. So Haifa is gorgeous to me. Yeah. But there's something creepy about the city too, because people just, they somehow have weird social signals and pick up, and they don't interact. So Palestinians will see each other and they'll greet each other warmly and they'll get on the bus, but no Israeli will talk to them. I went to a conversation that really sticks with me, and I've used it sometimes as an example in classes about the social impact. There was an Arabic language instructor there at the university, and I got based at the university. I was hanging out there for a while, so I got to know a number of the faculty, and she teaches Arabic for a living. And I come to find out that she doesn't actually understand the Eastern Levantine Arabic. She understands only Modern Standard. And I'm like, well, cool, but you live here. You could just walk down to Wadi Nisnas, which I'm doing every afternoon. You could talk to people and you could pick shit out. Like walk into a bookstore, talk to people, they're right there. And she looks at me and her eyes bug out. And she's like, but I'm a Jew. Like it's never occurred to her that she would go and talk to Palestinians in the same city. I think that, and this is a person that considers herself a liberal, supported a two-state solution. The problem ultimately around things like a two-state solution is it allows for the illusion of a potential peace without dealing with the ideological separation that built up in the first place, that says this is a different population, that kind of like racist element that's in there. Right. It allows them to to never criticize that aspect of the founding ideology. And I think that's the core problem here. Thinking that you can just solve the problem by giving them a chunk of land, it doesn't, because it never actually deals with the long-term consequences of that separation or either population's traumas. And they're going to be much stronger as a state, as a country in the world together anyway. So I think that the hard part is going to be to get people, even liberal people, to really spend time talking to each other, to humanize the other side, to recognize each other's pain.
And I appreciate that. And we try to convey, on some of these panels, I think we always address it from a humanitarian perspective. And you hit the nail on the head. One mental state of mind, and the human aspect, and there is a long runway ahead of us before these things can be identified and addressed. And so, thank you for addressing that. Kim, what else? I know I'm seeing a lot of. Yes, Bella, you can ask questions in the chat. There's a lot, and I just want to address Kim. Are you good still as a moderator? And what questions do we have from the chat?
Yeah, I'm fielding some of these questions. One that comes up in my lives quite often is it seems like a sentiment to reject, because the UN's called out Israel a couple times over humanitarian concerns, illegal settlements, things like that. And then someone brought up in the chat, why do Zionists refuse the presence of UN peacekeepers? Is there a reason behind that sentiment that the UN can't be trusted?
Well, yeah, I mean, and honestly, the same reason that the U.S. historically wasn't. It's really been an interesting shift to see. I don't know if anyone's noticed this, but the U.S. actually does have a radar base now there for like watching missiles and stuff down in the desert. It's actually, I don't know, like 40, 50 miles. I'm like, it's not too far from Gaza, but that took a long time to get approval for. And there's been a little bit of expansion there recently, but they've historically not wanted to deal with that. The risk is, if anybody ever opposed their policy, they'd have a way of doing something about it. And you just don't want that. It's a sense of basic sovereignty. Would the U.S. accept Chinese peacekeepers because we oppress the fuck out of black people? I mean, you go like, okay, look, George Floyd protests or whatever, police can't keep control, no one trusts the police. Hey, we don't trust the police. Let's have the Chinese come in. There's no fucking way we'd do it. So the Israeli position is basically the same, for the same basic reason. There's a sense of like a kind of prickly, a sense of this is our neighborhood.
And then there's one follow-up. Sorry, just really quickly.
Go ahead, Kim.
Asked this a couple times.
Yeah. Since
UN Resolution 181 required land ownership to be protected, was it doomed to lead to war?
Yeah. The key there, and this is one of the things people most don't like thinking about, because it really gets to the reasons for things like the Nakba. The Zionist movement was determined to create a democratic state. They wanted elections. They didn't want a dictatorship, but they wanted it to be a distinctly ethnically Jewish state, which meant they needed a Jewish majority. This is why the right of return is a non-starter, and why, for me, again, a two-state solution just doesn't work. A one-state solution, constitutionally recognizing both people, could allow for a right of return without changing things. But if you maintain an ethnic understanding of the state, where an ethnic Jewish majority is required, then people can't ever come home. So the key there is people's right to have and own their property, people's right to return to their property. They can't accept it for ideological reasons. So it was always going to lead to things like this. And it's honestly one of the main reasons that we see so much of the last century of struggle is that basic concept of ethnocracy that's built up there. And there historically have been a lot of other ethnocracies in the world. Just given, part of my family background is Irish. I'll talk about the Irish case a lot. And Northern Ireland used to be an ethnocracy too. It's really only with more recent, arguments, things like the Good Friday Accords, things like that started bringing some more basic representation. But it used to be a Protestant ethnocracy that explicitly oppressed the Catholic population in Northern Ireland. There's been a lot of them in our modern history. Israel's legal structure is designed to privilege one particular ethnic group over all other ethnic groups. And that makes it very difficult to recognize anyone else's claim to land, because if they're there and they're citizens and they own land, then they get to vote. And you see where I'm going with this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kim, other questions? Do you see any, Liam? I see one about, does the PLO in Egypt not support the blockade in Gaza?
I saw one a little bit ago that was interesting, if you don't mind.
No, please take it.
Somebody said, had asked, ask him if he thinks that Zionism is racist. And it makes sense because there's been a number of UN General Assembly resolutions that have said Zionism is a form of racism. It's a tricky one to note. I'm tempted to answer in both in two different ways on it. The key behind it is that nationalism itself is technically racist. If we accept that basic definition, then Zionism has to be racist. But if you're okay with German nationalism and Russian nationalism and French nationalism, then it's much harder to say that Zionism is racist. So it ultimately comes down to the basic definition, because Zionism starts as a secular nationalist movement that does aim for the exclusive rights of a particular group of people. If anyone doesn't know what nationalism means, it has nothing to do with patriotism. Patriotism is loyalty to your country. Nationalism is loyalty to your nation, and a nation is a group of people with shared characteristics. So you get to define that group of people. So you say, these features make up the kind of people that are my peeps, and I'm loyal to them. It has nothing to do with humping the flag, serving in the army, anything else. It's not at all connected to that shit. Nationalism is about a group of people, which means that nationalism, by definition, creates exclusions. It is inherently racist. And again, race isn't a physical thing. Race is a social category for groups of people. So we used to much more commonly talk about the German race or the French race in European history. A lot of American discourses get caught up much more in sharper physical differences because of the history of slavery here. But race isn't a physical issue. It's just a way of separating groups of people from one another. And if you're saying these features mean you don't fit my definition of, just look at the fact that in Israel, you have conscription for people, but you don't have it for the 1948 Arabs. They're mostly excluded from it. Or that discrimination is legal in employment or residences or whatever. There's different laws that apply based upon your ethnic identity. That's nationalism in action, because nationalism is the idea that groups of people, nations, deserve a state that serves their interests exclusively and no one else's.
Terrific. Appreciate the clarification. Important to note that. I want to go back here. Let's see. Did you see do you believe Israel is fascist?
It depends on what people mean by that. It's tricky. When you say, is a country fascist? Well, no, constitutionally, Israel is not a fascist state, but its current leadership is. And so that's different. A country can elect a fascist leader or a para-fascist leader, a neo-fascist leader, and not complete a transformation institutionally to lock that power in. That hasn't happened. It could happen conceivably there, just like it can happen here. It absolutely could happen in the US as well, but it hasn't. We have elected people that are like that, but it hasn't changed the country yet. So Israel, no. The Likud,
Officials,
yes.
Thank you for qualifying that. I think we often need to come up and distinguish between the government officials and the people of Israel, and I think that's a great clarifying point. Curly asks,
this is a good one here too. I love, someone says they don't have a constitution. Yeah, they do. They don't have a formal written constitution. Just like the UK. The UK has a constitution. They don't have a formal written one. Within constitutional law theory, there's different ways of doing a constitution, and informal ones set out certain basic principles, certain basic laws and whatnot that kind of make up, and certain, so in the absence of a formal written one for Israel, there's a handful of basic laws, capital B, capital L, like certain basic laws that stand above all other laws. There's the background of English common law that they build on, and then the ideology of Zionism. And the combination of those three creates a constitution within which the legal system can function, the judges can function, but they don't have recourse to a written constitution. They can't the way the U.S. can. So yeah, there's different ways to be a constitutional republic.
Awesome. Thank you, Bella, for the question. Curly asks your thoughts about the current Palestinian Authority.
Again, a little too open-ended for my poor little autistic brain. I have a lot of thoughts about them.
Give us, if you were to ideal leadership today that would take over for the Palestinian Authority, and we'll come back to them.
Well,
what does it look like for you?
Go back to the '06 prisoners document that says you need some kind of unity among different factions and representative institutions. So everyone needs to be at the table. They need to have regular elections. They need to have some kind of formal constitutions. They need to guarantee freedom of speech and assembly and freedom of information, which they've not done a good job of. The Palestinian Authority is a corrupt gangster regime. It's no better than a ton of other Arab regimes in the area, frankly. It's not representative. They don't have elections. They're not accountable. And it's deeply, deeply corrupt. It doesn't have to be. And tons of people in all these factions, one of the reasons I like pointing to the prisoners document is it was written by an imprisoned member of leadership from all 5 major political groups. And they all agreed, we want, our own separate state here. We want representative institutions and democracy, rule of law. We want some kind of like formal unity among the different factions. Right. They could build a democracy. The PA is not. The PA is basically Israel outsourcing some of its policing and municipal work.
And that's what I understand. It is. There is collaboration between the two. So the other name that comes up, and we've talked about this, is Marwan Barghouti. Marwan Barghouti. What are your thoughts? Do you know about him? What are your thoughts?
I mean, like anybody else in it, he's kind of caught up in the system, but has occasionally tried to. Okay, it's tricky. So it's one thing to stand outside a system and say this is all fucked up, right? And another to get involved and try to change it without yourself getting implicated in all of it. And these are the problems with a lot of leadership that gets into the PA. There are definitely people who are better than Abu Mazen involved here, but I think I saw, this was actually a few years ago. I think he was already saying that they should just fold up the PA, just close shop, don't do it anymore, because it's not going anywhere. It's basically just doing Israel's dirty work. And I kind of agree.
And it's been touted several times that's the case.
Yeah, the problem here is that there's been a lot of intentional efforts to stymie it, and frequently from the U.S. We, in some ways, play a heavier role in making sure that the PA can't function than the Israelis do. Everyone likes to go back in the context of the current fight there and say, oh, people voted for Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist group, wants to kill all Israelis or whatever, and makes all these kind of points there. But, when Hamas actually participated in that election under the authority of the PA, they implicitly accepted the framework of the PA and the idea of a two-state solution and elections and democracy, and i.e. not imposing Sharia law on people. Mm-hmm. And they got involved and they participated in the election. And that's an opportunity to bring a group in from the cold to kind of like think about the long-term process in Europe as a quick side parallel. There's a whole bunch of explicitly Christian-themed parties in Europe, but they're not trying to impose a theocracy. They would have a couple hundred years ago, but they've been involved in the process for too long. They've been essentially tamed in a way. They use it to form their own ethics to drive their policies, right? So they're personally believing Christians, but they accept the Constitution and they work within it. There was an opportunity to start bringing groups like Hamas in, just like there is in tons of other Islamist parties in other parts of the Arab world. But instead, their participation in the electoral process, we ignored the fact that they were implicitly accepting and recognizing Israel's existence by joining the PA and participating in that election, and instead say, oh, they're a terror group, you can't deal with them. Oh, they're involved in this, we're going to cut all funding. And we did. And if U.S. cuts all funding, and we help train and arm a lot of the Palestinian police and whatnot there, the PA can't survive on its own. Its economy is too small. It needs outside support. And if you diplomatically isolate them and economically isolate them, all it does is it drives them apart. We we pushed Hamas back out into the cold, and ultimately they ended up seizing control of Gaza because we forced a split in the PA. But in the prisoner's document, you've got a senior leader from both Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad joining with like Fatah and the Popular Front, the Democratic Front, to say, hey, we'll take a two-state solution in the West Bank and Gaza, and we'll recognize Israel and everything else. Here's all the stuff. We'll do all that stuff. And our response to that was, no, you won't. And we cut them out. And it created some significant long-term problems. We're not a fair dealer in this problem. We have a very specific agenda.
Yeah. Well, with that, what hope is there then for a solution if the U.S. stifles of the recommendations?
Yeah, that's the real trick, and it's one of the reasons that I often try to push specifically Americans to get involved here, because there are two ways you can put pressure on our government. One is electorally, so get involved in the primaries, support politicians that won't be as shitty on this. In the general election, you're stuck with whatever lesser evil you can make, but in the primaries, you got some choices there. But all throughout, both during that and when people are in office, street power, man. Tons of organizing, hit them economically, big disruptions, make noise, force a change. This still is, we're losing our freedoms, but we still technically are a republic. Our representatives are still to some degree beholden to us, and we can force a change there. But if you stand back from it, if you assume that we're powerless and we hold on to this sort of learned helplessness a lot of Americans have, then our government's going to do exactly what it's been doing all along, because a lot of its donor class are Christian Zionists, and they have a vested interest in keeping things going exactly the way they are, because they
status quo.
Well, they want much worse. They want this ultimately to turn into a massive war with the Muslim world that will cause the destruction of Israel and the death of most of the Jews, and that will bring Jesus back and all the rest of this stuff. It's a really regressive ideology, but it plays a significant part in American politics because of the rise of an evangelical movement in politics from the 1960s on, and the way that those churches, I honestly have a lot of sympathy. A lot of American Christian evangelicals, they don't even know the reason that they love Israel. They were just told their church, hey, we love Israel, we support Israel, we're a Judeo-Christian civilization. And like, cool, and they do. And their heart's in the right place. But they're being lied to by their own preachers, because their preachers want them to support Israel because they want the apocalypse. They want Armageddon in the Bible is the plains of Megiddo in northern Israel. They need a giant ass war there that kills a buttload of people. And because they are a significant political player in the U.S., you need to counterbalance that somehow. You need a whole lot of motivated young people, leftists, other people that can balance that out politically and pull us back. Our Congress has been in lockstep for a long time, specifically because of the donor class.
I love it. And one of the things that I was listening to, wasn't intending to join a live, and an individual was saying how to, whatever we are doing in terms of protesting, divesting of funds, putting pressure is not helpful. And what you just validated the fact that it is. I had to jump on and share, no, you can't mute your voice. Change only happens when we collectively come together and ask for the change. So thank you for underscoring the importance
it's a good one there. I just saw 2 people in a row mention AIPAC. Please don't. Go
for it.
They're a powerful lobbying group, right? They really are, but don't give them more power than they have, because it's a lot of lobbies and a lot of donors. If you completely removed AIPAC tomorrow, if they did not exist, hell, if you removed the entire Jewish electorate from this country, our policy wouldn't actually change unless we get involved and change other things, because there is still so much institutional power there behind a ton of these Christian Zionist movements that have nothing to do with AIPAC at all. So yes, they they are a problem, but they're a problem the way all lobbyists are a problem. We in the U.S. have a deeply corrupted government. It goes way, way beyond that. Please don't. There's a danger in pointing too much to AIPAC of falling into the old anti-Semitic patterns of Jews control the government. That scares me.
I have 3 questions. 2 are from people in here, and then one I just thought of right now. The one that I thought of, I'll start with this. would you classify the United States as a corporatocracy? Um,
Um, uh, Not really. I often don't like the way that people use those terms there, especially when people use like corporatism. Even more so, it's a problem because it actually had a very different meaning. I kind of liked the terminology that Sheldon Wolin used of inverted totalitarianism, where rather than the state dictating everything, the corporate sector dictates to the state.
yes.
Because that's kind of what we have. But corporatocracy just it hits the back of my head a little bit too much like corporatism, which you saw in the classic era of fascism, which has literally nothing to do with multinational corporations. It meant something very different. So I don't know. But corporate control is extremely strong in the U.S., much more so than in much of the developed world, and it's one of the reasons we're down to 62nd place in freedom. I mean, the U.S. is classified as a flawed democracy at best. We are slowly losing our rights here, and it's because we took them for granted. We didn't stay in the streets. If we aren't active and involved, I mean, it's not just there's the street power, and then there's also the political power, paying attention to the news. You're picking the right people out. As Eisenhower said, an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. We're asleep at the wheel, and we've been asleep at the wheel for decades, and it's fucked us.
Can you hold on for a second? Kingdom, what's this? Pali, free of Muslims. Okay, so can we block Kingdom of Judah, please?
Oh,
If
that's
I understand-
And then I'm pretty far back in the
that's a
chat,
pretty
so
obvious name.
I'll catch up in the chat here soon. But Bella asked a while ago, would you classify what's happening
gonna
in
block
Gaza
him.
right now as genocide?
Oh, he's already blocked. Oh, you blocked him. Go ahead, Liam. I think the question was, do you classify what's happening in Gaza as a G-side?
Yeah.
You talked yesterday about textbook. I was listening to you, textbook G-side, and I took a lot away from that. Would you mind going through some of the things that define a textbook G-side?
I can really briefly recap some of it, but yeah, I put up a little 10-minute thing on this a day or two ago.
Follow Liam to get it too, guys. Make sure. Go ahead.
The problem here, and one of the things people get caught up on with it, first there's the legal definition comes out of a UN convention. Opening up a dictionary to it is not going to give you the actual definition because the definition was created by scholars who proposed this to the UN, and that's your standard. And in that it talks about attacks on groups of people, right? But people as people. So, and they had to drop out the political one because the Soviets wouldn't accept it. But if you are attacking people for racial reasons, ethnic reasons, religious reasons, or national reasons, right? If that's the reason you're going after them, a lot of people coming back and they say, well, the population keeps going up, and there's it hasn't killed that many people, blah blah blah. It can't be a genocide. Well, genocide isn't killing a whole lot of people. That can be part of it, but all it means is if you're killing people because of a targeted reason, if you're killing them because of their identity, their ethnic identity. In this case, Palestinians are not what Israelis want in that area. There's an ideological issue going back more than a century. So the language used about them, I mean, references to from Netanyahu, references to the Amalek story. This is a historic enemy that was down in the Negev that was always a problem, and they had to be wiped out like root and branch, kill all of them. Right? When people are making references to nuking or whatever, you're talking about the people. When President Herzog is saying that that all the people there, children, whatever, they're all responsible. They're all part of this. They're all Hamas. That's taking it beyond a political fight with a particular group of militants or something, or the struggle over territory, and making it an ethnic fight when you're saying that all of the people are responsible. That is by definition targeting an ethnic group. It wouldn't matter if they killed only 100 people. If that was the reason they did it, it would still count.
Intense.
And the reason for doing it, yeah. The other part of it is that there's actually 5 different features of genocide, and people always lean only on the first one, which is killing members of a group for their identity. But that's only one of them. Any one of the 5 actually fits a definition. So if you're just causing serious bodily or mental harm to a people, that counts. If you're setting up conditions that would make it difficult for a population to thrive, that counts. There are other features to this. Mm-hmm. You can see a number of these directly in play in what's happening here. Now, it's come up and down a few times in the long history of this conflict. It's not like a long-term consistent thing, where the policies never really change. But technically, and this is where people sometimes make a distinction between ethnic cleansing and genocide. Legally speaking, ethnic cleansing has no definition. It's not actually a thing. It's a convention we use for chasing populations out. In juridical terms, in legal terms, ethnic cleansing is a form of genocide. So it fits into those second and third parts of those 5 parts. The 2 and 3 there, if you're chasing people out of their homes and dispossessing them, you are inflicting conditions, making it difficult.
Yeah, terrible conditions, as a matter of fact,
causing mental and bodily harm.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So technically, the Nakba is a form of genocide, even though there were people who died. A few hundred people died in it. There were quite a number of small scale massacres that took place, but mostly it was just dispossession. Mostly it was just chasing 750,000 some people out of their homes. But that's fits the definition.
Well, my grandfather and uncle were part of that first one, and they were the ones part of the first massacre. Liam, so we're at 8:34, man, and I promised you an hour and a half, and I know you have a school night. What are your thoughts about sticking around some more?
I can stick around until about 9 or so, and then I should probably get to sleep.
All right. So Ham, you can ask anything you want if you just want to put it in the chat. Guys, share the live. We've got another 26 minutes with Liam. Hopefully, and I'm going to drop this in my podcast, if you're okay with that, Liam, conversewithjbs.com. So it'll be dropped.
And if you don't mind, I can put the video up on my YouTube as well later too, if you.
Oh no, not at all. Please do.
One last thought on the question of genocide that I think will be useful for people too, is one of the reasons that this is sort of tricky to bring up is that there's no way it's going to be prosecuted anyway.
Talk to us about that, because you mentioned that a couple of weeks ago.
Generally speaking, the powerful are not held to account anywhere. And almost none of the genocides in the last century have been prosecuted. Almost none of them. So it's completely normal for them not to be. Under the convention, they recognized what happened in Bosnia. But they didn't even bother recognizing, so you've got Cambodia, East Timor, Rwanda, the Eastern Congo, the Darfur part of Sudan. There's tons of examples here over and over and over again in the years since the creation of that convention. Mm-hmm. Were not recognized because it's very difficult. It's not just a matter of reaching a factual high bar. In the specific context of this fight here, the specific context of the fight in the last couple of months, in Gaza, it fits the technical standards factually, but it wouldn't make it in terms of international politics because international law isn't a real thing. This, I think, is a sad realization for a lot of people because the media throws the term around constantly and never bothers to tell you that it doesn't actually exist. International law is a set of polite conventions that we all tell ourselves we will observe, but it's always up to the individual countries to enforce those laws. There's no enforcement mechanism for any international law. It's all down to the laws in those countries themselves. And if countries don't feel like prosecuting it, if one country objects to it, and vetoes it, or the country in question themselves says we're just going to ignore your rulings, they can. The World Court has ruled against the U.S. in trade issues over and over and over again, and we've just said, fuck you, and just carried on doing what we do. There's no way to enforce that stuff.
Yeah.
So while you can say it fits the definition, don't get your hopes up that anything will come out of that. It's just it can be like it's a moral victory if you want to take it that way, but that's all you're ever going to get out of it. We can't even get things like East Timor recognized. There's no way you're going to get Gaza recognized.
Yeah.
Kim, did you have some questions?
There's one other question I thought was really interesting. It's been brought up a couple times. Do you have any knowledge about what Israeli children are taught in schools regarding the history of Israel? Is it an accurate representation? Is it, no?
It's I'll be fair and say that the textbooks in both Israel and Palestine are terrible. And if someone's interested in diving into that, I've got a number of works by Israeli sociologists that have studied the textbooks and their impact psychologically on kids that going into, because it's just like it is here. Kids aren't born racist; they learn it from people. So when you are confronted with a lot of this stuff, the basic myths, it's in many ways very similar to what people get in the U.S. People are fed a lot of foundational myths about the U.S. that have nothing to do with our actual history. And it makes it very difficult to have those conversations as an adult, because someone's like, we're the land of the free and the home of the brave. I'm like, dude, we support European colonial powers every single time. We've never supported freedom in the world. It's just not what we're into, but you can't get over that initial conditioning. And the textbooks that both Palestinians and Israeli kids get, like this early school children, they're terrible. On both sides, the green line isn't present in their textbooks. It's just not there. The whole country is theirs. So it's it does give particular impressions to people. It does give you a sense of entitlement. And if you grow up thinking that way, people have to consciously challenge themselves. And this is a point I often make about discussions people might have in their lives today with people, like I really want to get people to understand this issue. I want people to kind of like get over these ideas they have. People have to change their own minds.
Yeah.
Someone has to consciously choose to unfuck themselves. And if someone isn't willing to do that, and instead they stay in that happy early place with that early indoctrination, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So the school textbooks are a really good question to bring up. So yeah, if anyone's interested, I've got a number of works that have specifically studied that impact and then looked at the long-term psychological development of kids in both Israel and Palestine and what this does to them.
Awesome. Follow Liam, guys. There's so much that you can gain from him. Kim, so guys, for those of you in the chat, thank you for asking questions. Keep asking. Kim is our mod. I'm not bringing anyone else up today, but I'm just going to check on Kim real quick. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
Awesome. Haytham, put your question in the chat. My friend. We'll get it. Kim, what other questions did I miss or that Liam may have not seen?
I'm looking back up in the chat right now. Hiba did ask if you could provide any sources. I don't know if she's talking about the Palestinian textbooks. I think you referenced them at one point.
Same thing as always. Just tell somebody to connect to me. I'll pull out. I'll talk to them. I'll pull out the books. I'll give them good names. But I always want to get a sense of what people really most need.
Awesome. Hiba, go ahead and send him a DM. He's pretty responsive. Kim, what other ones did you catch, sir?
I'm going up right now. I got stuck up in the chat with a couple that I thought were good, and I didn't want to forget them. So let me scroll up a little bit here, see if I could find something.
As he does that, the question of apartheid comes up quite frequently. Do you think the state of Israel will fall like an apartheid South Africa?
This is a point that I frequently make to proud Israelis, to Zionists, to supporters of the state there, that if you are supporting Israel's current policies, you are signing the death warrant of the country. It can't survive in the long run. There's literally no way. If its current policies carry on for another 60 years, demography alone will create a situation like South Africa. Right now, the populations are pretty evenly split, but the Palestinians have a higher birth rate. And if they ever realize that shooting back doesn't work as well as just sitting down and blocking the streets, if you end up with massive nonviolent demonstrations and it's a larger population, that's when the rest of the world's going to care. When you have a majority population in a territory that is overtly oppressed and not fighting back, yeah, that will cause the kind of economic and diplomatic pressure that will destroy the Israeli state. They have an opportunity now to kind of manage that, to sort of lock in a lot of the things that would still make it a Jewish state for them, that would leave them feeling happy. If that doesn't happen, what my biggest long-term fear is something like what happened in Algeria, that the conflict drags on for a long time, you lose all the moderates, everyone's unhappy at the end, and then by the end, a significant chunk of the population just ends up leaving. I don't want people to have to leave their homes. I don't think you solve one injustice by another injustice. So I worry about that, but on the current trajectory, yeah, there's really no way to avoid that. as soon as the Palestinians massively outnumber them. And here's one key to something to hold on to too, because a lot of people really get caught on this whole question of the occupied territories. The simple fact is, from the moment they decided they wanted those territories, the intent was always to stay with it. You didn't have an ability to kind of pull out of it. It's not part of any other country. Gaza has never been part of any country since the Ottoman Empire. So it's not occupied territory from anybody else. It's literally just Israeli territory that they haven't extended their full laws to. It's Israeli territory that's under military rule. And since 1994, the same is true in the West Bank. As soon as Jordan released its claim to it, it's Israeli territory that they keep under military rule. So don't keep this artificial distinction in your head there that means that we shouldn't think about that whole population. It's not just the 1948 Arabs or the Israeli Palestinians or Israeli Arabs you want to think about. It's all the populations in the West Bank and Gaza as well. They're under Israeli rule. And right now, those populations are about even. You let the Palestinian population grow for another 60 years, Israel can't survive.
And it's sad to think another 60 years that
we never annexed it, though. Just for the person who brought that up, Egypt was a military occupier of that territory, but it had no status at that point.
And then
he's actually saying the opposite. He's saying they are occupied. What he's saying,
they're occupied, but they're not anyone else's territory that's occupied. It's literally Israeli territory that's held under military rule. So it's not as much an occupation as it is. Again, you're stuck with the term apartheid. You're applying two different legal systems within the same country. Functionally speaking, as far as the way the Israeli administration works, they are part of the territory, but they've never been fully annexed. So if they were annexed legally, all Israeli law would apply to it, and they would have to give citizenship out, and they didn't. Instead, they want a situation where they can keep the territory, do whatever they want with it, but not give citizenship to people in it. So, it's in some ways the term occupation is problematic. We're kind of stuck with it because it's in common use, but I want people to understand that it's a little bit more complex than they tend to think. It's not no one else's occupied territory. It's literally Israeli territory. It's their sovereign territory. They've just chosen not to fully extend their law into it and accept that population as citizens. Hey, don't do that.
Haytham, hopefully that answers your question on that one. I saw another one from Haytham. I just want to let's take a look. Or I may have missed it. So there was a question around protest in 2018. They tried peaceful protest in 2018. What are your thoughts on that, and what transpired?
Well, the key on any kind of nonviolent protest movement is it has to be sustained. None of the stuff happens easily. Frequently, I don't know. Just look at people often use the case of the independence movements in South Asia when you're talking about nonviolent movements as opposed to violent movements leading to independence, right? But we forget that stretched on for 40 some years before Britain finally said screw it, and it had to cost them a lot of money and prestige in the process. So it's difficult to do. It's emotionally difficult. It's hard to tell people don't fight back, but in the long run it is more effective in terms of changing the narrative internationally. Every single time militants strike back, because it plays into a history of collective trauma on the Jewish side there, that plays to sympathies internationally that actually harm the Palestinian cause. Palestinians have to take seriously, as much as it really isn't their fault that they didn't create the situation with the Jewish trauma there, they have to take seriously that it does exist and it affects the international dimensions. So to be most effective for them, you need sustained nonviolent protests. And there wasn't enough international awareness. If something like that had carried on year after year, and then you start seeing it on TikTok and YouTube and shit, and eventually news reporters are forced to cover things. They often don't want to. There was an issue we saw with the Arab uprisings when they really getting going in 2011. Initially, no one wanted to talk about it. They just ignored it. Person after person after person was setting themselves on fire in Tunisia and shit, and no one was doing a damn thing about it. And in fact, France got away with offering riot cops to Tunisia to beat the protesters up. But when internet activists started spreading the news around and more people started tuning in that way, that forced the major media to pay attention to it. And when those cameras showed up and they looked at it, it got a lot harder for the governments to back those corrupt regimes. We need something very much like that on a sustained level for the Palestine issue, because there are serious emotional and cultural considerations that mean it will take longer. So you have to don't go into this with like blinders on. Realize this will be difficult.
Right.
But if you can sustain that kind of energy long term for years, and people can raise awareness, if we can be pointing, look at what they're doing, while it's happening,
right,
that will make a difference.
Awesome.
And then,
Kim, and other questions in the chat that I missed? I know.
Ham had one question that Hiba also wanted me to hit on. He was asking Dr. O'Mara to critique the narrative Zionists give to the Nakba was mainly due to Arab leaders telling Palestinians to leave.
It's literally false, and we've known it's been false for decades. The key there is that Israel actually does have a Freedom of Information Act, and researchers got access to those archives in the 1980s. And by the mid-1980s, you already had scholarly works using Israeli archives that said, yeah, our government's been lying to us. This shit didn't happen. It never happened. It was literally just a nationalist lie that they made up and spread as a narrative. And it dug in pretty insidiously, both in Israel and in the diaspora and in countries like the US, such that by the time, and this is one of the nice things about Freedom of Information Acts, they're always decades after the event. By the time the nerds get in there and look at this shit and we see it, it's often too late. And you can't get through that conditioning to actually tell people, look, dude, you were lied to. I mean, but yeah, it was literally never true. Again, 200,000 people had already been pushed over the borders before the 1948 war even started. The process was well underway. About almost a third of the population that ends up losing their homes had lost it before any of those countries got involved. And those armies did almost nothing. The Lebanese contingent stayed along the border, mostly inside on their side, and actually Israel sent soldiers into Lebanon during that fight, but occasionally they came across and helped a village right near the border. The Iraqis did some fighting in the northeast. The Egyptians just got their asses kicked in the desert. They did almost nothing useful. And the Jordanians mostly sat on their hands, except for the area around East Jerusalem, because they'd already made a deal for most of the West Bank. And the only thing that was up in the air was Jerusalem. So these Arab armies didn't really contribute to the fight at all. It's largely a matter of, and honestly, the internal documents from the Israelis themselves, from Zionists and then Israelis as a country is created, they knew and they said over and over, we're not threatened. There's no way any of these guys can touch us. We have a massive advantage here. We're going to win this and we're going to take the territory. And the focus throughout from late 47 all the way through to the end of 1948 was always on pushing Palestinians out and taking territory, never on fighting the Arab forces. That was never the threat. They were saying in public, this will be a new Holocaust, worry about us. They were telling the world, because that gives you cover for what you're doing. And again, given the history of the Holocaust being only a few years earlier, everyone had a reason to plug their ears up and pay no attention. There are, if you go back to newspapers at the time, and I've done this with the US, there's a shit ton of reporting in the US of massacres and ethnic cleansings. We saw it happening in real fucking time in the US, but we chose not to do anything about it.
Kind of like today.
Well, yeah, exactly. But some of the reporting was a lot more critical. And there was actually much more critical reporting of Israel throughout in the late 40s all the way through the 1950s into the early 1960s. It takes quite a while for the U.S. press to really to abandon some of that, and a lot of that has to do with the government's position shifting. And the government, like the executive's position, shifted largely because of Congress's shift. As Congress got more and more in lockstep with Israel because of the Christian Zionist donor class and whatnot, that changed our government's policy a bit at a time. So there's like transitional periods. But Eisenhower was frequently very critical of the Israelis. I mean, it stayed a tricky issue for quite a while. But in 1948, while they told people to worry about them, they were not remotely concerned, and they spent most of their effort chasing people out of their homes and villages. And that was a very organized operation.
Thank you for that. You talked about the media and their slow process to recognize that some of the information is propaganda. What's happening with the Palestinians, and we're here, what, 50 days in, and now some of the narrative is starting to change with some of the media. Do you see that, or is my lens a little different?
It really depends on what you mean, because eventually, as simply the death toll goes up, there will be more critical reporting.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always still going to be framed in such a way that it still comes across as like a self-defense issue, which is how we framed 67 and everything else. Even though they're frequently not self-defense in any way, that's how it is going to be framed and understood, and that will stay that way. I don't think that can change. And a lot of that just has to do with the fact that in the Western world, there is far greater familiarity with the long-term history of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. So there's a great deal of sympathy for that generational trauma that makes it difficult for us to understand what's going on the ground. We don't have a lot of reporters on the ground. We don't pay attention to it. U.S. media doesn't put people in Gaza. They're just not there. So it's all sort of secondhand, and it's filtered through a lot of our pre-existing beliefs. It will get a bit more critical of the attacks, and there has been some of that. But honestly, some of that was clear from the beginning too. It's ultimately not going to make any difference. You're not going to see calls in the U.S. media that are really going to attack the government's policy.
So we've got a few minutes here, but are there questions that you guys feel like asking in the chat that we haven't asked? Let me know.
There's something that was a little more current.
What was that?
You can go for whatever question you want.
I saw somebody
ask
I think Egypt would get involved. Like if they push people into the Sinai, would Egypt get involved? Realistically, if they are going to push people into the Sinai, they'll have made a backroom deal with the Egyptians already. Even if they don't, I think the Egyptians would still roll over for it, because they don't have a whole lot of other choice in the matter. They never really have. There's no way in hell Egypt gets involved militarily. They stand to lose everything and gain absolutely nothing out of it. I mean, they lost in 48, in 56, in 67, in 70, in 73, like decisively every time. They have no interest in any kind of military action there, and they'd be a lot weaker, in terms of a fight with them now than they were then. So. No, even if the Israelis decided to completely cut them out and just do what the hell they wanted to do, they still wouldn't do anything.
Let's see what else there's in here that
the Houthis are involved. Someone said, but that's irrelevant too.
There was a question that I think is just relevant currently. It was about what do you have any predictions for what you think will play out in the coming months? I guess.
History can give you patterns. It's not good at direct predictions.
Mm-hmm.
On past, based on previous patterns, if there isn't any kind of significant push from the outside, and this is what's always difficult to predict because there's tons of things can change. If circumstances change, then my read of what will happen will change, but that's on a daily basis. If nothing changes currently in terms of the way the international climate is set, then the Israelis are going to keep this up as long as they can get away with it, because they're determined to impose a new type of leadership on Gaza and knock Hamas out of it. They could change their mind on that because Hamas was frequently a useful tool for them. They frequently even funded them, and they used them as a foil against the PLO.
Yep.
But I think that the amount of the way that the attack is played out in the Israeli media and the kind of trauma that's come out of that, I don't think they can get away with it in the same way. I think that they need to make an example of them somehow. The fact that they don't have a way to do that there is no actual military solution to this, that turns it into a kind of longer term struggle. I think that the current path is going to see them in some kind of long-term engagement here, trying to put together some new proxy in place there. But there's a lot of factors externally that can change that, and a handful of ones internally that can shift the calculus a bit and change that. But as it stands right now, yeah, Netanyahu will still stay in power as long as it looks like they're making some progress. People are not willing to drop out of it. And it's one of the reasons that he hasn't, like the people that have said the most horrific shit, he hasn't kicked them out outright. I mean, they can't remove enough people from this cabinet without causing the government itself to collapse.
Right.
And they had what, like 4 elections in 5 years? They can't do another one. So
let's pause. It's a good place to pause. We're at 8:58, man. I know you got to work tomorrow. I am recording this. It will get dropped in Liam's YouTube channel. I'll put it on my podcast, conversewithjbs.com, here in the next couple of days. But Liam, first of all, let me just thank Kim. I'm going to come to you in a moment. Kim, thank you so much, man. Really appreciate the support. I am going to stick around a little bit in the live if you all want to come up. I didn't bring anybody up simply because we wanted to do a one-on-one interview. Liam, thank you for the time. I know how busy you are. It was very informative. People are telling me that they want to do a second round of this because they have a ton of questions. You and I can coordinate that. But Liam, you have office hours too. Would you want to plug that real quick?
I've kind of fallen into the habit of doing these on Friday evenings when I get home. I have a lot of traffic on the way back up the hill because I live on a mountain and I have to commute in for work. But I'm usually home a bit before 8 p.m. Pacific time. And when I get home, then I can turn this thing on and I'll stay as long as people want to go at it, because as long as people keep me talking, I don't get tired.
I love it.
I can only do that on Friday nights because I don't have to worry much about what time I get up on Saturday, but most of the week I get up at 4 a.m.
Awesome.
So
Awesome.
But Friday evenings, pop on. I'm perfectly happy to help out, ask any questions, like whatever Q&A, bounce around. And somebody said a moment ago, if in thinking of like a kind of like a last word point, I just want to make a point because somebody said this seems hopeless. And
go for it.
Believe me, I get that. And it's not just this issue. I teach like political violence. I study a lot of really fucked up stuff in the world. I got into studying like nationalism and racism and fascism, all kinds of horrifying shit. And things can seem really, really bad. One thing that you learn as a historian, though, especially when you're taking like the long view of things, is that things always do change. Nothing stays forever. No ideology lasts forever. So if you're stuck on like, oh, well, there's no way we can get over these ideas and hatreds, yes, you can, because it's happened repeatedly in our history. Tons of things can change this, and there are a lot of things that we can do to help that along. Right, there's a ton of stuff that we can do in terms of organizing, nonviolent resistance, demonstrations, all kinds of things we can do that can help along here. Never think that it's hopeless, because as soon as you think it's hopeless, as soon as you accept that learned helplessness, you've let the other side win.
Thank you. Awesome, Liam. Again, appreciate you. Have a great night, man. Stick around. We'll stick around for a little bit. If you have questions, I'll bring some people up in the chat. So grateful for you and the time that you spent with us.
No worries.
I'll chat with you offline. Have a good one, Liam.
Yep, have a good
Liam.
So let's see if people want to come.
This one is somebody says the name. This one's Minerva, or Minerva if you want to do it in English. So Minerva was my Roman war goddess, and then the gray one that was in my lap at the beginning was Socrates, a little philosopher.
Thank you, Liam.
Have a great night, folks.
Yeah, thank you.